Welcome to Dimensions in Chumash by Rabbi Immanuel Bernstein, part of our collective Journeys in Torah. Welcome to Dimensions in Chumash. I'm Steve Geller. This week, Rabbi Bernstein will present us with a panoramic view of some of the most amazing articles of the Big Day Kahuna, and do it in only the way that he can. Let's jump right in. V'yasisa choshen mishpat, and you shall make the breastplate of judgment. You shall fill it with 4 rows of stones. One of the fascinating elements among the priestly garments discussed in this week's parsha are the 12 miluyim stones that were attached to the choshen breastplate, worn by the Kohen Gadol. Each stone bore the names of one of the 12 tribes, so that the Kohen Gadol bore their remembrance with him wherever he went during his service in the Beis HaMikdash. Rav Levi Yitzchak Berditchev explains the special significance of this idea in terms of understanding the essential role of the Kohanim in general and the Kohen Gadol in particular. The Kohanim had been separated from the other tribes in order to perform the avodah. This was not in the interest of detaching themselves from the Jewish people, but rather of representing them. The avodah is something that only Kohanim can do, but it is done on behalf of the entire people and with their ultimate blessing in mind. In order to keep this crucial idea in mind, the most distinct and distinguished among the Kohanim, the Kohen Gadol, could not be allowed to perform the avodah without having the names of all 12 tribes constantly before him. Pasuk 21 states that each of the 12 miluyim stones had the name of one of the tribes engraved on it. V'ha'avanim tiyen al Shemos b'nei Yisrael. The stones shall be according to the names of the sons of Israel. 12 according to their names, engraved like a signet ring, each according to that tribe's name. Some commentators have noted that the analogy to a signet ring doesn't seem entirely accurate. A name on a signet ring is certainly engraved, but it's actually engraved backwards, so that when the ring is applied to the wax to make the seal, the letters in the seal read forwards. It doesn't seem that this would be the case with the engraving on the miluyim stones. However, Rabbi Yoshua Leib Diskin says that actually the pasuk's analogy is correct. He draws our attention to the beginning of our pasuk. V'havanim tiyen al Shemos b'nei Yisrael. The literal translation of these words is that the stones shall be on the names of b'nei Yisrael. Well, this doesn't sound right. The stones weren't on the names were on the stones. Well, this is why the translation for the word al is according or with, so that the stones were not on the names, but according to the names. Rav Diskin, however, says that the word al should be translated as on, for the stones were in fact on the names of Bnei Yisrael. And how is this so? The names of the tribes were not engraved on the stones that faced outwards, they were engraved on the back part of the stone that was attached to the choshen. Since the stones were translucent, the names could be read through the stones by anyone who looked at the choshen. Now, how perfect! The pasuk says that the stones were on the names of Bnei Yisrael because the stones actually lay on the names. And of course, that creates another problem. If the names engraved were attached to the choshen, with the name being read through the stone, the names would be backwards. Well, this too, says Rav Diskin, is why the pasuk told us that the engraving was like a signet ring. In other words, backwards. So now, seen through the stones, they would be read correctly. It's just beautiful. And Rabbi Bernstein calls this a chiddush in the pshat of the pasuk. An additional insight into the names engraved on the choshen comes as it relates to another of the Kohen Gadol's garments, the golden tzitz worn across his forehead. Pasuk 36 informs us that the tzitz had 2 words, Kodesh LaHashem, holy to Hashem, engraved on it. The Gemara in Sukkah cites the opinion of the sages that Kodesh La was engraved below, and Hashem's name was engraved above. The commentators wonder why these words would be written in this way and not on one straight line as words are normally written. Another question, what's referred to with the words holy to Hashem? The Torah already informed us that all of the priestly garments are holy. Why then would one of them need to be marked especially holy? The Rashash explains that the words holy to Hashem are not to be read by themselves, and they do not refer to the tzitz. Rather, they're referring to the 12 tribes whose names are engraved below on the choshen. It's the Jewish people who are holy to Hashem, with the choshen and the tzitz combining to communicate that very message. Therefore, says the Rashash, since the flow of reading goes upwards from the choshen to the tzitz, the descriptive phrase on the tzitz itself likewise goes from down to up, Kodesh La below and Hashem's name above. Again, just a perfectly logical explanation. An additional element within the Choshen is mentioned in Pasuk 30. V'nosata el Choshen hamishpat es ha'urim ve'es ha'tumim. You shall place in the breastplate of the judgment the Urim and the Tumim. The Urim v'Tumim allow for messages to be received from heaven to answer questions that were of national or communal concern. The Gemara explains the background to this name. Urim, their words illuminated, signifying the illumination that they brought to the questions that were posed through them. And Tumim, their words completed, reflecting the idea that an answer received through them was final and irrevocable. The Gemara goes on to describe that when a question was asked of the Urim v'Tumim, the answer would be transmitted by the relevant letters in the Miluyim stones, either protruding or illuminating. What emerges is that in addition to prophecy, which existed primarily as a means through which Hashem created His will to the Jewish people via the prophet, the Urim v'Tumim existed as a way for people to ask vital questions of Hashem and receive His answer. In this regard, the Gemara lists the Urim v'Tumim as one of the 5 things that were absent during the period of the second Beis HaMikdash, where the divine presence resided to a lesser degree than it did with the first Beis HaMikdash. The Urim v'Tumim were a mystery. The Torah doesn't even specify exactly what they were, and more than that, it doesn't even mention any command to make them. The only instruction concerning them is the one mentioned in our pasuk, to place them in the Choshen. Stranger still, the Torah refers to them as the Urim and the Tumim, which sounds like it's referring to something previously known, even though this is the first time they're being mentioned. Rashi states that the Urim v'Tumim was a small scroll of parchment with Hashem's ineffable name, the Shem HaMefarish, written on it. This approach is endorsed and elaborated upon by the Ramban. Rambam doesn't specify what the Urim v'Tumim were, but in Hilchos Beis HaBechira he writes that they were still worn during the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. He explains that even though the Gemara lists them among the items that were absent during that era, this means that they didn't perform their prophetic function, but nonetheless still needed to be worn. If not, the Kohen Gadol would be lacking the prescribed number of special garments required in order to perform the avoda. There are commentators who understand that the Rambam agrees that the Urim v'Tumim were Hashem's name written on parchment and maintains that their presence within the folds of the Choshen was critical to its status as one of the priestly garments. So Rambam agrees that even though they were no longer functioning as the Urim v'Tumim, they still needed to be in the Choshen. Other commentators explain that the Urim v'Tumim were in fact the Miluyim stones themselves, not an additional item added to the Choshen. The name Urim v'Tumim, according to this approach, does not indicate a separate entity, but rather an additional quality of the stones that they transmitted prophetic messages. It's fascinating to consider this prophetic aspect of the Choshen, which is certainly very different than the general function of the Kohen's garments, which are all focused on the avoda in the Mishkan. In fact, according to the Ran, this point is addressed by our sages in the Gemara. When Moshe is first told to go and act as the Redeemer for Bnei Israel, Hashem informs him that on his return to Egypt, he will be met by Aaron, who will be glad in his heart to see him. Commenting on these words, the Gemara says, Bischar v'ra'echa v'samach b'libo, zacha l'choshen hamishpat al libo. That the reward for fulfilling, he will see you and be glad in his heart, Aaron merited, and Aaron shall carry the judgment of Bnei Israel on his heart. The Ran asks, what does the Gemara mean to say? If it's that Aaron merited to be the Kohen Gadol in return for being glad on Moshe's behalf, why is the Choshen mentioned specifically as his reward? Rather, he explains Aaron's heartfelt joy for Moshe reflected an extremely lofty quality. After all, Moshe was coming to Egypt as Hashem's prophet to redeem the people from their exile. Aaron had already been a prophet for the people for many years. So in effect, he was stepping aside from Moshe to assume the role that had been his up until that point. The graciousness of this gesture, as well as Hashem mentioning Aaron's heartfelt joy for Moshe, is truly worth taking a moment to appreciate. In fact, it could be one of the most beautiful elements within the entire Exodus story. And it did not go unrewarded. Aaron's role as Kohen Gadol only needed to be focused on matters of avoda. However, Hashem rewarded him with the Urim v'Tumim, a vehicle for prophecy that he carried on his heart in recognition of the role of prophet that he allowed Moshe to assume during the Exodus. Once again, Rabbi Bernstein takes us on a tour of the Jewish camp in the desert, pointing out things that we never noticed. Just another reason that you should like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and hit the share button to paste the link to this video into emails and texts to family and friends. They'll enjoy it as much as you did, and we all know the reward for graciously sharing Hashem's Torah.